3 days into no food, an old mountain trapper is still splitting firewood at first light. His hands steady, his pace even. He hasn't eaten since Tuesday. And it's Friday now, with 2 more hard days of travel standing between him and his next meal. Most modern men go pale and short-tempered before they've even missed a single lunch, and they'd swear they could never last a day out there doing what he's doing. But it was never grit that carried men like him through the empty stretches. It came down to one plain rule about how the body actually works, a rule almost nobody alive today has ever been taught, and I'm about to hand it to you exactly the way it was handed to me. My name's Cole Hartwell, and I've spent better than 50 years living and working in the mountains of northwest Montana. 38 of those years earning every dollar I ever made off that country. I've wintered alone up there 19 times, in stretches where the temperature dropped past 50 below, and nobody was coming to check on me if I got it wrong. My grandfather Amos put me on a ridge for the first time, when I was 8 years old. When Amos had done with his teaching, there was an old trapper named Pete Dumont who took me further. French-Canadian on one side, fur trade blood going back generations. Gruff and exact, never wasted a word or emotion. He taught me how to keep myself alive on next to nothing but a knife, a blanket, and a calm head. I've guided better than 400 people through that same country since, and I've been called out on more than 30 searches for folks who got lost or hurt in it. Everything I'm about to tell you, I didn't read off a page somewhere. It got handed to me by men who learned it the hard way, and I mean to hand it to you the same plain way it came to me. I'm not guessing. I paid for it. By the time we're done here, you'll understand exactly why an empty stomach never scared the old hands the way it scares folks today, and you'll know precisely what they protected instead of chasing food. There's a rule sitting under all of it. Most folks who call themselves outdoorsmen these days have never once heard that rule laid out plain, because the whole modern world runs on the idea that a missed meal is some kind of crisis. And it plain isn't. Right now, if I asked you what kills a man fastest out in that country, you'd probably tell me starving does, and that answer is wrong enough to get somebody killed. Folks get this order backward almost every time. Water comes first, because a body starts breaking down inside of about 3 days without it. Shelter and warmth come second, because losing your body heat kills a man quicker than almost anything else out there, and it doesn't take an Arctic night to do it. A plain, cold rain and a soaked shirt will finish that job just fine. I've walked whole groups back into camp, shivering hard with a full lunch still zipped in their pack, more worried about the meal they'd missed than the fact that they were freezing right in front of me. Food comes dead last on that list, and that's the part that trips people up. A healthy grown adult can go 3 weeks or more without a single bite. As long as the water keeps coming and the weather isn't trying to kill him some other way, survival men have an old rough saying for this order. Something like 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter in rough weather, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. It's not a precise clock you can set your watch to, more of a loose good built out of hard experience, but it gets the order right, and that order is the whole point of everything I'm telling you today. Now, I want to be straight with you about that 3-week number, because I'd rather you trust me than be impressed by me. It only holds up if you've got water. Take the water away, and that same body is in real trouble inside of 3 days, no matter how much fat a man's carrying, or how tough he thinks he is. And that's the piece almost nobody explains right. Your body isn't sitting there empty the moment food stops coming. It's already loaded with fuel stored up in advance for exactly this kind of stretch, the way a woodshed gets stacked full before the first snow ever falls. For the first day without food, your body runs on a quick reserve of sugar it keeps banked in the liver and the muscle. The same way a stove keeps a few dry twigs stacked close for a fast light. That reserve burns off fast. usually inside of 24 hours. Once it's gone, the body has to find another way to keep the blood sugar steady enough to keep the brain running. So it starts building a little glucose on its own, out of scraps, mostly out of the leftover building blocks in your own muscle. That keeps things steady for another day or two. And it's exactly the stretch where hunger hits hardest and a man's temper goes short, because the body hasn't fully switched fuel sources yet. In between, roughly from day 1 to day 3, the body leans on a stopgap, building fresh blood sugar out of spare parts, mostly lactic acid and the leftover pieces of broken down muscle protein, just enough to keep the brain fed while the bigger switch gets underway. It's not an elegant system. It costs the body a little muscle to run, but it buys time. And time is exactly what a stranded man needs most. Somewhere around the 2 to 3 day mark, the real shift happens. The body turns hard toward its own stored fat, breaking it down and running the heart, the muscles, even a good part of the brain on it instead of sugar. Doctors call the state it settles into ketosis, but you don't need the fancy word for it. Just think of it plain, as the body finally switching over from the kindling to the main woodpile, and running steady off that instead. Once that switch happens, something strange happens that catches nearly everybody off guard the first time they hear it. The hormone that makes your gut gnaw and demand food actually settles down, and the sharpest hunger a man feels is usually in that first day or two, not on day 5 or day 6 like you'd expect. That's backward from how everybody assumes it works, and it's exactly why an old trapper 3 days into no food could still split wood at first light without shaking apart. His body wasn't screaming at him anymore. IT had already made peace with the situation and gone to work on the reserve it was carrying. And that reserve runs long. A healthy adult with decent fat on him and steady access to water can hold out 3 weeks or more before real trouble sets in, which means those first few rough days are nowhere near the edge of anything dangerous. They just feel that way, because nobody ever explained to you that the worst of the hunger passes before the real danger would ever show up. I want to plant a flag here before we go further, because I'd be lying to you if I let this sound easy or safe to test out on purpose. This is what the body does to survive an emergency IT didn't choose. Not advice for skipping meals at home to prove a point. What throws people off worse than anything else is simple. It was never the empty stomach that put men in the ground out there. It was what a man did about that empty stomach once it scared him. I had a young man with me once named Tyler Brandt, 19 years old, strong as a colt, carrying the best gear money could buy. A whiteout rolled in on us, and instead of sitting down and waiting it out, he panicked and ran, trying to force his own way back to camp. He sweated himself soaked doing it, and the cold finished what the panic started. Less than a mile from a warm fire I had going, I couldn't reach him in time. And I think about that boy every single day of my life. It wasn't the mountain that killed Tyler. It was the fear in his own chest, and what that fear talked him into doing with his legs. What makes it worse is timing. Panic over hunger usually hits on day 1 or day 2, right when the body is still perfectly capable and the danger is nowhere close to real yet. That means the single most dangerous moment in the whole ordeal is usually the very first day, back when a man still has every physical advantage and simply doesn't know it. That's the trap sitting underneath almost every survival story that ends badly. The mind quits long before the body actually runs out of anything real. And chasing food when you're already worn thin makes the whole thing worse, not better. A man burns through his heat and his water thrashing through brush after a rabbit he never catches. And he ends up worse off than if he'd simply sat still and let the reserve he was already carrying do its job. I'll tell you plain, I've made this exact mistake myself, a long time back, as a boy trying to prove something to my grandfather. I spent a whole freezing day chasing game I never caught, and came back soaked through with sweat and shaking cold, with nothing to show for it. Amos didn't yell at me. He sat me down by the fire and said, "The cold have you long before the hunger does." And I've never forgotten it since. The mind that stays calm and refuses to quit is worth more out there than any amount of toughness. And nobody can sell that to you in a store, which is exactly why almost nobody bothers teaching it. Panic is the actual danger, not the empty stomach itself. The old hands didn't fight it by hunting harder or moving faster. They fought it with 3 plain habits, and every one of them comes down to the same idea. Protect what's already keeping you alive, instead of spending it chasing what isn't urgent yet. Habit 1. Water before food. Always, no exceptions. Your body needs water just to break its own fat down into usable fuel. A dehydrated man can be sitting on 3 weeks of stored energy and still can't get at much of it, because the chemical process that unlocks that fat slows down hard without enough water running through him. Eating dry food while you're already dehydrated backfires, because digestion pulls water toward your gut and away from the rest of your body right when you can least afford to lose it. The rule was simple. When water runs short, you drink what you've got. You don't eat around it. I lost a man once to the opposite mistake. His name was Gus Hale, and I found him dead in his sleeping bag one fall. He'd rationed his water down to almost nothing to make it stretch, and there was a live creek running a half-mile from where I found him, with water still sitting untouched in his own pack. Weak and confused from running dry, he'd laid down and never got back up. Your body puts water to better use inside you than it ever will sitting in a bottle on your hip. Habit 2. Conserve energy on purpose, even when every nerve in your body wants to get up and do something. Every bit of effort you spend is reserve. You're burning. So the old hands slowed down and rested, instead of thrashing around trying to force a solution. The common mistake here is treating stillness like giving up, when it's actually the opposite. A man who sits tight, builds a small fire, and waits out a bad stretch is doing more to keep himself alive than a man who's up and moving just to feel like he's fighting back. Boring is what surviving actually looks like. Movement without a clear destination or a clear reason isn't grit. It's just reserve leaking out through your boots for no good return. Habit 3. Stay warm and dry. Cold does more than make you uncomfortable out there. It actively drains the same fuel tank you're trying to protect. Shivering alone can push your body's calorie burn up several times past its normal resting rate while it's happening, which means a cold, wet man is spending his reserve at a rate that would shock plenty of folks if they saw the numbers. Staying warm was never about comfort for the old hands. It was rationing, plain and simple, keeping the fire fed so the body didn't have to feed on itself just to hold its own temperature steady. The common mistake is thinking wet gear can wait until camp. Wet clothes pull heat off a body many times faster than dry ones. The moment you're soaked through, you're already spending reserve you didn't plan on spending. The honest fix is drying out and warming up before you do. One more single thing. The mountain men got ahead of the lean days weeks before those days ever showed up, and that's the part almost nobody talks about. When game was running thick and the eating was good, the old hands ate hard on purpose, gorging deliberately on the fattest parts they could find. Deer fat, bone marrow, rendered grease worked into pemmican that would keep for months without spoiling. A smart old trapper would pass right over a skinny rabbit and go a half-mile further for one fat beaver or one well-larded duck. A scrawny animal gives a man almost nothing to store, while a fat one hands him weeks of banked fuel in a single kill, rendering that fat down slow over a low fire and working the grease into dried meat to make pemmican wasn't some quaint old custom for its own sake. It was the entire strategy. Even the bones didn't go to waste, cracked open and boiled down. They gave up a last dense pocket of grease plenty of folks would have thrown out with the scraps, because the old hands knew there was no such thing as too much banked fuel heading into a Montana winter. The old hands understood that lean meat alone, without the fat riding along with it, would barely keep a man standing through a hard week. That wasn't gluttony, and it wasn't a lack of self-control. It was a calculated move, the same as a man stacking his woodpile as high as it'll go before the first real storm rolls in. So the old hands ate hard for the week ahead, and harder still for the month behind it, banking fuel they knew they'd needed long before they needed it. That's the real difference between a mountain man and a modern man standing in the same empty stretch of woods. It was never that the old hands felt hunger less, or that they were built to touger than anybody alive today. They simply refused to get caught flat-footed. They charged the battery every single chance they got, so that when the lean days finally showed up, the fear of them had already been spent in advance. The lean stretch never surprised a man who'd already fed the fire it was going to run on. So there's your rule. Hunger isn't a 5-alarm fire. It's a feeling your body was built to carry you through. Not a signal to panic over. Charge the reserve while the food is there. Guard it hard once it isn't, and keep your water moving, your body warm, and your feet still. Next time, I'll show you how the old hands made the pemmican that made all of this possible. Every step of it, from the raw fat out to the finished cake, and why a pack weighing 2 pounds could carry a man through 10 days of hard country. If you want more of this, subscribe. Tell me down in the comments how many days you figure you could actually go, because every honest guess teaches the rest of us something worth knowing. Drink your water. Guard your heat. That's the whole rule. And it's kept better men than me.